Hey guys, tonight we return to the kind of stories you'll never hear in any history class. The kings of medieval Europe, men crowned as God's representatives on earth, yet ruling and living as though they were demons wearing crowns. In the dim, flickering glow of candlelight, you'll see long banquet tables overflowing with wine and meat, laughter echoing beside the muffled cries of the damned. Behind the opulent stone walls of their palaces lay secrets so dark that even hell itself would turn away. From divine madness sanctified by holy law to desires that broke every boundary of morality and faith, this is a world in which you, perhaps, would not survive a single night under the rule of such kings. They ruled not only with the sword, but with fear, with pleasure, and was the terrible power of making their subjects believe that their sins were the will of God. So before we begin, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if these stories truly bring you something of worth. And tell me, where are you listening from tonight? What time is it there? Is the night as quiet where you are as it is here? Now then, turn off the lights, sink beneath your warm blanket, and let us step gently together into tonight's story. In the late medieval and early modern centuries, Europe was a vast stage where faith and power performed the same play. In those days, people believed that the throne itself was sacred, and that the one who sat upon it was a man of God. Faith was stitched into royal robes, poured into wine, and written upon every decree. A king did not merely rule his people, he ruled their souls. Every word he spoke could decide who would live and who would die, and every mistake could be washed clean by the same refrain: "It is God's will." Yet when night fell, within those gilded halls, the men who called themselves heaven's chosen often became what they most feared: devils in human form. In the kingdoms of England, France, Denmark and Sweden, the idea of absolute monarchy was not just political theory, but a kind of sanctioned sorcery, a divine spell that made madness lawful. A king could order an execution on a whim, take a wife, kill a wife, or confiscate the property of an entire family in a fit of rage. Within the palaces where candlelight shimmered on silver mirrors, power became the most intoxicating drug mankind had ever known. Not opium, not wine, but the feeling of being God. From the 13th to the 17th century, kings across Europe lived suspended between sanctity and sin. The church declared them divinely chosen, while the people saw them as beings above the law. When a king sinned, no one dared call it sin. They only said, "He must have his reasons, reasons we cannot understand." And so, from London to Versailles, feasts, executions and conspiracies coexisted beneath the same vaulted ceilings. Loyalty was a game, and faith a weapon for control. You walk through the great hall, the echo of guards' boots on the stone floor, the heavy scent of wine mingled with burning oak in the air. On the throne sits a man in a crimson robe, his pale face powdered to the colour of marble. He could be the King of France, or England, or any man called Your Majesty, but in truth, he is the creation of a system that believes bloodline alone grants dominion over the world. In that age, no one would dare call him mad, even if he spoke to statues or ordered a man's death for a glance. Madness was dressed in ceremony, renamed vision, and praised as divine inspiration. Europe was not lacking in knowledge, but knowledge bowed before faith. No one was allowed to ask why a man could act against God's word while claiming to rule in his name. And in that silence, that forbidden space where doubt could not exist, the deepest corruption took root. The kings became living proof of an ancient truth. When man believes himself divine, he becomes most cruel. Chronicles of the time tell of banquets lasting until dawn, where blood and wine mingled on the floor, where music and screams shared the same rhythm. In rooms draped with silk, a courtier could die for entering at the wrong moment. In the hall next door, a priest would bless the feast, believing he served a holy purpose. And all of it was accepted because no one dared to ask, is this still human? You stand among the crowd, watching faces bow low before the throne. They are not fools, only people trying to survive in a world where to live meant to believe that the king was God's reflection, no matter his cruelty, to believe that punishment was justice, even for the innocent, to believe that silence was virtue, even when filled with rage. Such was the essence of absolute monarchy. Persuasion was unnecessary when all were made to kneel. Over time, madness itself seeped into the structure of rule. Executions were written into ceremony. Rage was redefined as faith. The death of thousands became the will of God. Dynasties fell, not for their sins, but because sin had become the law. In a realm where morality bowed before the throne, there was no longer a line between saint and monster. The tale of the throne and its sins is not merely about kings gone mad in gilded robes. It is a quiet warning about the nature of power itself. When no one dares to restrain a man, he does not go mad in a single day. He drifts there slowly until evil becomes habit. And in the flickering light of the old palace candles, the truth becomes unmistakable. You do not need hell to make a devil, only unchecked power. And thus begins the long tragedy of the dynasties we're about to enter, where the throne was not only a symbol of glory, but a mirror reflecting every sin that had been made holy. Absolute power, like a strong wine, always intoxicates the one who holds it, until he forgets that the people beneath his feet are still breathing. And when the last candles of the palace finally burned out, Europe entered a new chapter, one in which the drunkenness of power did not merely drive kings to madness, but stripped them of their very thrones. And no one embodied that fall more clearly than John of England, the man history would remember by a name that sounds less like a title and more like a verdict: John the Bad King. John was not born a monster. He was the youngest son of Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful dynasties in all of Europe. But being the youngest meant living forever in the shadow of greater brothers, especially Richard the Lionheart. When Richard died, John inherited the crown, but not his brother's valour. Instead, he carried within him suspicion, jealousy, and a hunger that could never be fed. He trusted no one, not even those who had once saved his life. In John's court, loyalty was a kind of foolishness, betrayal, a form of survival. You step into the Westminster Hall, its cold stone walls hung with tapestries of battles long past. At the centre sits the king, short, sharp-eyed, glancing restlessly around as if the air itself might be plotting against him. He raises taxes on everything: wine, bread, salt, even silence itself. Every coin taken from the people flows not into the treasury, but into lost wars and lavish feasts. When the Pope objected, John struck back. He seized the church's lands, stripped the clergy of their power, and defied the authority of Rome. A medieval king who turned against the church was not merely rebellious, he was cutting himself off from God. And when a man believes he no longer needs God, he has only one faith left: himself. The years of John's reign were a long, unravelling chain of failures. He lost Normandy to the French, shattering England's standing on the continent. But what the people hated most was not defeat, it was cruelty. John took hostages to extort gold, seized noblemen's wives, and ordered prisoners starved to death. In an age that believed kings ruled by divine right, John became proof that sometimes God stays silent, so that men might learn rebellion. You stand now in Runnymede, where the wind sweeps across the damp meadow and horses tread softly through the mud. Before you, armoured barons face their king. They no longer kneel. They demand a written promise, a parchment that would bind even the king to the law. John, cornered, has nowhere left to turn. He signs the document the world will later call the Magna Carta. To him, it was an act of desperate surrender. To history, it was the first spark of the rule of law. The Magna Carta was not born from kindness, but from fear. The fear that if absolute power continued unchecked, the entire realm would collapse with it. Every line of that charter carries the sigh of men who had once obeyed and were now forced to learn defiance. They did not ask for democracy, only for limits, and from those limits, the idea of rights began to take shape. John did not live long enough to see what his name had come to mean. After signing, he broke his oath, burned the villages of his enemies, and died alone, feverish, wasted, abandoned by his own men. Chroniclers wrote that God took back his soul the way a kite falls to the mud, not out of judgment, but because it had become too heavy with sin. Yet the paradox of history is this: tyrants sometimes create freedom, not because they intend to, but because their cruelty forces others to resist. John's greed and violence taught the lords, once loyal, that even power needs a leash. Runnymede became a symbol of restraint, and from that soil the seeds of justice, liberty and human rights grew slowly across the centuries. You look out across the misty field, hearing the distant toll of a church bell. No one present that day could have known they were witnessing the dawn of Western democracy. They only knew they were too weary to keep bowing, and in that exhaustion, that deeply human exhaustion, freedom was born. The story of King John is not the tragedy of one man, but a quiet reminder. Power never stops itself. It stops only when someone dares to make it stop. History, after all, is not always written by the virtuous. Sometimes it is written by those who sin so greatly that others are finally moved to stand. In a world where the throne once seemed untouchable, John proved that even kings could tremble before their own consequences, and so, whenever we speak of law, justice or democracy, we should remember these things were not born from goodness, but from darkness, from nights when kings defied both God and man, and through their cruelty, humanity learned never to let it happen again. After England had watched a king destroy himself through the weight of his own ambition, across the narrow channel, France was enduring a different kind of madness. Not the cruelty of a tyrant, but the slow collapse of a soul. If John of England had forced his people to rise and set limits upon power, then Charles VI of France would teach an opposite lesson. How an entire kingdom could learn to live beside a monarch whose mind was quietly breaking upon the throne. Charles came to power young, barely past 20, with clear eyes and noble ideals. France was still bleeding from the wounds of the 100 Years' War, debt, famine, and the endless feuding of noble factions. In his early years, people called him Charles le Bien-Aimé, the beloved king, for he lowered taxes, showed mercy, and tried to rebuild a country long exhausted by war. But history is like a mirror that cracks easily. Once fractured, it cannot be made whole, and the first crack in Charles's mind appeared one stifling summer afternoon as he led his army through a forest. During the march, a servant dropped a lance, a sudden clash of metal on stone. The sound struck Charles like thunder. He turned sharply, eyes blank and burning, then, seized by panic, drew his sword and began to strike at his own men. When the frenzy ended, dozens lay dead, and the king stood trembling among them, pale, empty, unknowing. From that day forward, France had a mad king. You are standing in the Great Hall of the Saint Paul Palace in Paris. Sunlight filters through coloured glass, scattering fragments of light upon the marble floor. In the quiet, Charles sits motionless, wrapped in heavy blankets, refusing to be touched. He whispers that his body is made of glass, that if anyone comes too near, he will shatter. His servants sew his clothes with soft padding so that he will not break. Each step he takes trembles, afraid of falling, afraid of touch, afraid of the wind that brushes against his skin. From that moment, the French court became an asylum in royal disguise. The nobles met not to rule, but to manage an illness. Every conversation was weighed carefully. Even a sudden noise could plunge the king into terror. When he was calm, the kingdom breathed again. When he fell into madness, all of France held its breath. No one dared to make a decision, for no one knew how long reason would stay with him. Beyond the walls of Paris, the country began to fracture. The Orléans and Burgundy factions fought for the regency, dragging the nation into a civil war. Everywhere, men killed one another in the king's name, though he no longer knew his own. Power, once the symbol of divine strength, now seemed fragile as the glass body its monarch imagined. The greatest tragedy was the silence. No one dared speak the truth, that the king had lost his mind. To say it aloud would have meant the collapse of the entire order, and so they pretended. They bowed before him as before a saint, even as they knew that within the throne sat a melting soul. They held feasts, issued decrees, and toasted his health, all to preserve the illusion that France still had a ruler. Chroniclers wrote that at times when Charles realized his own imprisonment inside his body and his crown, he would weep and murmur, "I am not a man, I am only a vessel waiting to crack." Through the dim reflection of glass you see him, hollow eyes, wandering gaze, a man drifting between two worlds, one of flesh and one of transparency. He no longer knows which is real. That sense of fragility became an image for monarchy itself, seemingly solid but ready to fracture at the faintest tremor of change. The madness of Charles VI was not merely a personal tragedy. It was the mirror of a system that had no room for weakness. When a king is not allowed to be human, his illness spreads to the court, and from the court to the country. Writers of the time said that Paris caught the king's disease, a city as lost and fearful as its ruler, trembling between pity and despair. During his reign, France lost much of its territory to the English. King Henry V exploited the chaos, marching deep into France and forcing the Treaty of Troyes, by which Charles had to marry off his daughter and acknowledge the English king as heir to the throne. It was the moment when France nearly ceased to exist, undone not by the sword but by the mind of its sovereign. And thus, absolute monarchy, once proclaimed the will of God, became a cruel jest of fate. Charles Thick believed himself made of glass, but perhaps he was closer to the truth than his mockers realized. For kingship itself was a fragile material, luminous, beautiful, yet unable to bear the weight of being human. It glittered beneath the light of faith, but a single crack of doubt was enough to make it fall to dust. When he finally died, the court sighed with relief, yet also with an odd sorrow, as though something delicate and transparent had been dropped and lost forever. History would not remember Charles as cruel, but as a quiet warning that madness can begin at the highest places. If King John was the lesson of the limits of power, then Charles VI was the lesson of its nature, that within every throne lies a hidden fracture. And in the dim light of his final evening, as the king sat alone among mirrors, one could see all of France reflected in his eyes, beautiful, proud, and forever on the verge of breaking. After France had sunk into the delirium of Charles VI, a king who believed himself made of glass, trembling within his own power. Across the Channel, England was slipping into another kind of tragedy. Not the tragedy of a broken mind, but of a heart forbidden to love. If Charles VI moved pity for his fragility, Edward II provoked the fury of Europe, because he loved the wrong person in an age that forbade a man to love another man. And yet history, however cruel, cannot deny that his story remains one of the most romantic and brutal tragedies of the Middle Ages. Edward II was the son of Edward I, the Iron King of England, the conqueror of Wales, the terror of all borders. His father was a symbol of order and might. The son, his perfect opposite, gentle, emotional, fond of music, painting, and the simple amusements of common men. As a young prince, Edward met Piers Gaveston, a knight from Gascony, handsome, witty, and unlike anyone at court. Between them grew a bond that defied every convention of their world. In letters that still survive, Edward calls him the friend of my heart, a phrase that scarcely hides what could not be spoken aloud. Picture it, the long corridors of Westminster Palace echoing with their laughter. Two young men, one a king, the other despised by every noble in England. Gaveston was granted lands, titles, and finally the earldom of Cornwall, a title reserved for royalty itself. He accompanied the king everywhere, sat beside him in councils, shared his table, his chamber, his trust. To the lords of England it was an outrage. In a world where power was bound to lineage and honour, a commoner at the heart of the throne was unthinkable. And when that man also held the king's heart, every dagger began to sharpen beneath the sleeves of velvet. Edward could not see, or would not see, that his love had become politics. By defending Gaveston, he defied his entire nobility. By raising him above them, he humiliated the bloodlines that had built the crown. The English court became a chessboard on which the king's private affection became the cause of civil war. One day, while Edward was away, the barons seized their chance. Gaveston was captured, accused of treason, and, as the chroniclers wrote, executed without need of God. They beheaded him on Blacklow Hill, left his body to the wind and the crows. When Edward heard the news, he collapsed in silence. He buried his lover as though he were a martyr, though he knew it would make him despised all the more. After Gaveston's death, Edward grew colder, lonelier, and lost. He sought redemption through war, only to meet ruin at Bannockburn, where the Scots under Robert the Bruce crushed the English army. It was one of the darkest defeats in England's history, and it broke what remained of the king's authority. Amid the chaos, Edward found another companion, Hugh Despenser, ruthless, ambitious, and cunning. But this time love was no longer tender light. It was dependence and shadow. Despenser ruled through cruelty, seizing lands, avenging insults, spilling noble blood. Under his influence, Edward II became a puppet, a king ruled by the man he adored. The end was inevitable. The remaining nobles allied with Isabella the Queen, intelligent, cold, and deliberate. With her lover Roger Mortimer, she led an army to overthrow her husband. When Edward and Despenser were captured, Despenser was executed in horror, hanged, drawn, and quartered before the crowd. Edward, born to silk and ceremony, was thrown into the darkness of Berkeley Castle. The records disagree on his final hours, but the legend that spread across Europe was too vivid to fade, that he was tortured with a red-hot iron, a punishment deemed fitting for the sin they believed he had committed. Listen, the wind sighing through iron bars, the faint ring of metal in the dark. No more music, no more laughter. Only a man waiting for death, perhaps still remembering the afternoons by the Thames when he and Gaveston believed love could outlive judgment, history calls Edward II the weak king. But perhaps his weakness was simply that he loved out of season. In a world where the order of God justified every cruelty, his love was branded a crime. Yet in his letters and chronicles, one truth endures. Edward was neither mad like Charles II nor cruel like John, only human, trapped between sword and heart, duty and desire, crown and self. The story of Edward the Year reminds us that power does not only corrupt by cruelty, it also forbids humanity. In that age, to love the wrong person was a death sentence. If Charles VI shattered within his dream of glass, Edward II shattered within the illusion of normalcy. One feared to be touched, the other was destroyed for touching love itself. Both reveal that no throne, however radiant, can hide the darkness of loneliness. And when night descends upon Berkeley Castle, we understand. History does not remember only the victors. It also whispers the names of those who dared to love, even when love itself was destined to burn. After Edward II ended his life in the shadows of Berkeley Castle, remembered by history as the king punished for love, centuries later, England would witness another kind of passion. This one was not forbidden, but sanctified by the crown, by the church, and by blood. If Edward had died for loving wrongly, Henry VIII lived to prove that even desire could be turned into state policy. His story opened an age in which the lust of one man could redirect the course of Europe, and where love became not a feeling, but an instrument of power and faith. Henry was not born a symbol of sin. In youth, he was tall, handsome, athletic, intelligent and musical, the perfect Renaissance monarch, blending grace and strength. But beneath the brilliance was a boundless ego, an unshakable conviction that he was chosen by God. And when a man believes he is the hand of God, every desire of his heart becomes divine law. You're standing in the great hall of Hampton Court. Red brick walls glow in candlelight. Music drifts through air thick with wine and perfume. At the centre, Henry V dances with Catherine of Aragon, his first wife, once the widow of his brother. Their union, sanctioned by the Pope, was meant to symbolise peace between England and Spain. But years passed, and Catherine bore him only one surviving child, a daughter, Mary. No son, no heir. For Henry, it was not just personal disappointment, but political peril. A dynasty without a prince was a kingdom built on sand. Then he met Anne Boleyn, sharp, radiant and dangerously intelligent. Unlike the mistresses before her, Anne refused to be merely a lover. She demanded a crown. Henry, consumed by her, decided to tear down heaven itself to possess her. When the Pope denied his request for annulment, Henry defied Rome. He severed England from the Catholic Church and founded the Church of England, with himself as its supreme head. The Great Schism began, a moment when religion became the stage for desire, but passion is a short candle. Once Anne became queen, Henry's devotion curdled into doubt. She bore him a daughter, Elizabeth, destined for greatness, but to him another disappointment. Within 3 years, Anne was accused of adultery, treason and even incest. On the day of her execution she wore grey, calm as stone, and whispered, "God save the king." The blade fell. The crowd was silent. That evening Henry dined with Jane Seymour, his next wife. Jane gave him the son he longed for, Edward VI, and died soon after. Henry grieved briefly. Then grief turned once more to appetite. His fourth wife, Anne of Cleves, was rejected as not pleasing enough. His fifth, Catherine Howard, was beheaded for adultery. His sixth, Catherine Parr, survived only by mastering silence and prayer. 6 women, 3 cast aside, 2 executed, 1 spared. Together they form the tragic constellation of Henry's reign. Henry did not merely divide the church, he divided England itself. Monasteries were seized, their treasures stripped, their monks expelled. Statues were smashed, relics burned, altars torn apart, a nation cleansed in fire, all because one man refused to be denied. And yet, irony endures. From this lust was born Reformation, the great reshaping of faith across Europe. When Henry declared that a king could stand above the Pope, he unwittingly gave birth to a dangerous idea. That man could stand before God alone. Out of personal desire emerged a revolution of conscience, and from a marriage dispute came the age of spiritual independence. In his final years, Henry grew monstrous in flesh and soul, his body swollen, his legs ulcered, his face pallid and scarred. Yet his eyes still gleamed when he spoke of power. He surrounded himself with portraits of triumph, saints, and kings. But behind the velvet and gold, there remained only an old man devoured by his own hunger. He had dreamed of an immortal empire. What he left were 6 tombstones, carved with the names of women consumed by his love. If Edward II died for forbidden affection, Henry VIII lived by permitted passion and weaponized it. One man burned himself in love, the other burned the world to keep love alive. Together, they mark the 2 poles of England's great tragedy. When the heart enters politics, blood is always spilled. Henry V stands as the emblem of a century where sex, religion, and power fused into one, inseparable and fatal. And he left behind a bitter truth, that no sin is more dangerous than the sin dressed in the robes of faith. For when a man uses God to justify his desire, he destroys not only the bodies of others, but the soul of an entire civilization. When the red walls of Hampton Court Palace began to green with moss, and the throne of the Tudors closed its long reign in the smell of wine and blood, Europe had not yet awakened from its dream of power. The intoxication of Henry VIII, where desire was sanctified by religion, was merely the opening act to a subtler, grander, and deadlier addiction, the addiction to pleasure that consumed Versailles under Louis XV. If the Tudors symbolized the separation of faith from power, the Bourbons embodied the death of both, drowned in the weary laughter of a dynasty that had lost its soul. Louis XV ascended the throne while France still shimmered with the afterglow of his great-grandfather Louis XIV, the Sun King. But the golden light of that age had grown too bright, hiding the cracks beneath. Versailles, once built as a monument to divine order and royal glory, had become a theatre of decadence, where authority and appetite blended like wine and blood. The young king was called Le Bien-Aimé, the beloved. He was handsome, gentle, with melancholy eyes that could melt an audience. But time transformed affection into contempt when people discovered that Louis XV loved everyone except his own duty. He ruled for over 50 years, yet Versailles ceased to be a seat of government. It became a cathedral of pleasure, where each banquet consumed enough food to feed a starving village. Outside, peasants ploughed dry fields under a punishing sun. Taxes rose, disease and famine spread. Inside the palace, hundreds of candles were lit each night for the soirées d'amour, the feasts of flesh. The nights began with wine and ended in the haze of silk and perfume, where rank dissolved, noblemen, priests and courtesans sharing the same bed under the pretext of merriment. At the centre of it all was Madame de Pompadour, his most famous mistress. She was not merely a lover but a political force, advisor, patron, and gatekeeper of royal favour. Pompadour understood that beauty survived only through influence. When her youth faded, she turned to art, philosophy, and the Rococo aesthetic, soft, luxurious, and utterly hollow. Versailles under her rule glittered with gold leaf and mirrored walls, its beauty a mask for moral decay. After her came Madame du Barry, the king's final mistress, a common-born girl turned into a luxury toy. By then, France was collapsing into financial ruin, yet the king spent fortunes on jewels for her while the poor died at the gates. It was no longer the sin of a man, but the symptom of a system devouring itself. If you listen closely, you might still hear the sounds of Versailles in those years. The clink of crystal goblets, the sweep of silk across marble, the forced laughter of courtiers, and beyond the locked windows the cries of hunger from the streets. Each drop of wine spilled a drop of blood for the coming revolution. They called the people the mob, the blood-holy wine, and believed that God still stood beside them. But once pleasure replaced God, collapse was inevitable. Philosophers, Voltaire, Rousseau, began to write, questioning justice, freedom, and the nature of man. Louis XV, once educated and thoughtful, merely shrugged. After me, the flood. It was not resignation, it was prophecy. And indeed, the flood came. When he died of smallpox, no one wept. Paris rejoiced. His coffin was carried through silent streets. Versailles, once the temple of divine kingship, became a mausoleum of guilt. He had been the beloved. He died the forgotten. The man who turned the throne into a banquet chair left behind only empty halls and the echo of broken laughter. From Henry VIII to Louis XV, Europe had completed its circle. From lust justified by faith to faith corrupted by lust. One used religion to conceal desire. The other used desire to replace religion. Both ended in blood. Versailles still stands, dazzling, suffocatingly beautiful. But if you listen in the night, beyond the marble and gold, you can almost hear the faint chime of crystal glasses, the brittle laughter of courtiers drunk on their own delusion. A laughter so desperate it could not hear the revolution knocking at the gates. When the final candle guttered out and the harp fell silent amid the smell of molten wax, Europe lost not only a dynasty, it began to lose its sanity. From England to France, from Sweden to Denmark, power no longer meant strength. It became a mirror reflecting the slow decay of the human mind. If Louis XV drowned in pleasure, his successors drowned in madness. No more wine, no more women, no more feasts. Only the solitude of the throne, where the crown pressed like a chain, and the court glittered like a golden asylum. The Age of Enlightenment, they called it. But its light scarcely reached the heads of kings. Outside, reason and science were rising. Inside the palaces, monarchs hid in dreams and delusion, as if insanity were the last refuge from the world they has broken. Christian VII of Denmark was one such king, crowned as a boy, raised without affection, only ritual and fear. He clapped his hands during councils, laughed when courtiers wept, and whipped himself during prayer. The court hid his madness, but all knew. The kingdom was ruled by a child in a man's body. Power fell instead to Johann Friedrich Struensee, the royal physician, a reformer, a man of reason. He abolished torture, opened schools, and banned clerical meddling. But in a rotting world, reason itself was a crime. When his affair with Queen Caroline Matilda was exposed, he was arrested, tortured, and beheaded one frozen spring morning. Christian, blank-eyed, watched and laughed, then cried. Denmark lost its only chance to enter the modern age because the crown rested on a madman's head. In Sweden, Erik XIV descended into paranoia. Brilliant, learned, once idealistic, yet suspicion devoured him. He slaughtered the loyal Sture family in a midnight frenzy, claiming divine command. He forbade mirrors, fearing they could swallow his soul, and made tasters test every meal. Finally deposed, he died alone, perhaps poisoned, perhaps consumed by his own mind. In Bohemia, Wenceslaus, heir of the great Charles IV, sank into drink and delusion. He drank by day, slept by night, ignored affairs of state. He mocked priests, bound prisoners for amusement, and whispered to ghosts. The empire his father built crumbled while he murmured, "All is well if I do not wake." 3 kings, 3 nations, 1 disease, the absolute loneliness of absolute power. When all fear the king, no one dares tell him the truth. Power becomes a mirror, reflecting not greatness but madness. A single nod can kill hundreds, and thus no one dares to say no. In that silence, reason rots. The throne becomes a gilded cage, where men lull themselves to sleep with dreams of divinity. And behind those stories lies not personal tragedy, but the tragedy of an entire order. When the king goes mad, the court follows. Flatterers rise, nobles fracture, the people starve. In Denmark, reform died with Struensee. In Sweden, noble blood ran through the streets. In Bohemia, incapacity gave birth to religious war. These kings are the mirror of Europe's deepest fear after feudalism. That reason itself could be strangled by the very power it created. For when a king is said to be chosen by God, who dares ask if God himself is sane? Thus madness was sanctified, murder was blessed, and truth was buried beneath crowns too heavy to wear. Today, in the museums of the North, you may see their portraits. Christian VII, Erik XIV, Wenceslaus, velvet robes, jewelled sceptres, serene faces. But look closer, and you will see it. The hollow stare of men who have lost themselves. And perhaps that is the truest portrait of power in the late Middle Ages, a dazzling mask concealing the slow collapse within. Madness was not an accident of a few monarchs. It was the final symptom of a system that made men believe they could rule the world without being reminded that they were still human. When Louis XIV died alone, he left Versailles empty. When Christian VII, Erik the Stoltel, and Wenceslaus faded into darkness, they left their thrones gleaming and unwanted. And as history closed that long chapter, only one truth remained. Madness is the last stage of every power without limit. The thrones of Europe had grown heavy beneath the weight of their own loneliness, and the continent began to seek a different kind of power, one not born of royal blood, but of an absolute faith in God. After dynasties decayed in pleasure and madness, the gaze of men turned eastward, where the Crusades burned like a promise of redemption for an entire civilization. Out of the ruins of corrupted kingdoms, a new order emerged, the order of faith armed with the sword. And it was then that the Knights Templar stepped out from the shadows of history, carrying both purity and obsession as the final symbol of a Europe torn between its hunger for salvation and its addiction to power. The story begins simply, almost humbly. After the First Crusade, when Jerusalem fell into Christian hands, thousands of pilgrims flooded to the Holy Land. But the road from Europe to Jerusalem was perilous, haunted by thieves, slaughter, and disease lurking in every mile of desert. In that year, 9 French knights led by Hugues de Payan swore before the Pope that they would protect the pilgrims with their own lives. They had no land, no wealth, only faith and the sword. The Pope granted his blessing. King Baldwin II of Jerusalem gave them quarters beneath the Temple of Solomon, a site sacred to both Judaism and Christianity. From that stone vault their name was born, the Knights of the Temple, Templars. They guarded not only the pilgrim roads but a symbol itself, that God did not dwell only in heaven, but wherever a blade met blood. Soon the small brotherhood became a machine of terrifying perfection. Under papal protection, they were freed from taxes, granted lands, and answered only to Rome. Their discipline bordered on inhuman. No money, no family, no desire. They ate in silence. They slept in armour, ready to die at any moment. Their oath was not merely of loyalty but of erasure, to become nothing but instruments of divine will, and from that devotion rose the most fanatical warriors of Christendom. In battle they knew no fear, never retreated, never trembled at the cries of the dying. While secular armies hesitated, the Templars charged first, the red cross burning on white tunics, believing that to die by the hand of an infidel was the purest grace. Muslim chroniclers said they fought as if without souls, for death, to them, was no end. It was the door to heaven. Yet the more they fought, the richer they grew. Every conquest brought spoils, and the Templars used them to build a network of commanderies across Europe, from Paris to London, from Lisbon to Prague. They built castles, churches, and soon became bankers of the nobility. A pilgrim could deposit gold at a Templar preceptory in his homeland and withdraw it in Jerusalem using a handwritten receipt, the first form of international banking. That was when faith began to merge with money, and once those two touch, purity dissolves. The Templars grew too powerful, too wealthy, too independent. They had their own army, their own economy, a network beyond the control of any crown. Within a few generations, the poor Knights of Christ had become Europe's greatest financial and military order, the Bank of God, from which even kings borrowed. And when a religious brotherhood holds both the souls and the purses of mankind, then even God, if he exists, must step lightly around them. From the lens of history, the Templars embodied the essence of the medieval spirit: absolute faith, iron discipline, and a morbid yearning for salvation. They believed that to fight was to pray, to kill was to purify. To the world they were crusaders, but to themselves they were penitents, offering each drop of blood as proof of how far loyalty could go. Yet, like every perfect order, they carried within themselves the seed of ruin. For when men believe they serve God, they forget they are still men. Within the white stone walls and solemn chants, whispers began to rise: ambition, doubt, and the thirst for power. And power, even when wrapped in a cross, remains the most dangerous temptation of all. Looking back at their journey, from 9 impoverished knights swearing to die for faith, to an army of thousands managing the wealth of Europe, one sees a deep paradox. The Templars did not merely protect faith, they redefined it. In their hands, faith ceased to be humility and became a means of control. But that belongs to later chapters, when their power would make kings tremble and their faith would burn in the very flames they once lit. For now, as the 12th century closes, the hooves of the Templar horses still echo across the Mediterranean. On battlefields of dust and blood they ride with steel flashing under the sun, believing themselves to be the hand of God upon the earth. None of them know that this very certainty, this perfect faith, will one day be their death sentence, and that perhaps is the eternal tragedy of the Middle Ages. Everything built from faith will, in the end, be destroyed by it. When the white-clad warriors of the temple returned from the desert, their horses carried more than dust and exhaustion. They bore chests of silver and gold, offerings and pledges from souls who'd entrusted their salvation to God. Yet while kings and popes still busied themselves with blood and crosses, the Knights Templar quietly built another kind of dominion, the dominion of money, shielded and sanctified by the holiness of their robes. In the last chapter they were faith armed with the sword. Now they had become faith armed with a vault. For the Crusades had not only forged warriors, they had forged trade routes, flows of wealth, and the peril that came with them. From London to Jerusalem stretched thousands of miles haunted by pirates, deserts, and taxes. No one dared carry gold through that journey, and so the Templars conceived a new invention, a tool we would now call credit. A pilgrim could deposit his fortune at a Templar preceptory in his homeland, receive a handwritten receipt encoded with secret symbols, and withdraw his money upon reaching Jerusalem. To the people of the age, it was a miracle. No relic, no prayer, only faith in the red cross on parchment. Faith, once bound to church and sacrament, was now transfigured into financial trust. In a world where sin could once be washed away with blood, it could now be washed away with coin. Thus, from a network of pilgrim shelters, the Templars transformed into Europe's first international banking system. They managed the deposits of nobles, loaned to kings to fund wars, and safeguarded the treasuries of popes. Historians often say that to trace the Templars' commanderies across France, England, Portugal, Germany, and Italy is to see the earliest outline of a financially unified Europe. But they went beyond simple money transfer. They invented credit itself. A lord could borrow for his campaign, mortgaging his land or title. A widowed lady could entrust her dowry to the order in the name of God. Poor pilgrims were lent money for their journey, at a holy interest, not written in any ledger but paid in labour or tribute. In this way, the Templars made money sacred. They never called themselves merchants, but keepers of the treasure of faith. They did not claim to hold money, only the wealth of God. Yet, no matter how pious the name, the truth remained. The Templars were the first to learn that belief could be converted into currency. And from that moment, the border between the sacred and the worldly began to blur. In their strongholds, the Templars built vaults as solid as fortresses. The same men who once slept on stone floors in poverty now guarded hoards of gold they swore did not belong to them. But wealth has its own will, and it always finds a way to own its keepers. Rumours spread. Some said they had unearthed treasures beneath the Temple of Solomon. Others whispered they guarded the Holy Grail, the ultimate vessel of divine power. True or not, the legends gave them an aura of dreadful mystery. To the people, the Templars no longer guarded pilgrims. They guarded the fate of Europe itself. For whoever controls gold controls war, and whoever controls war controls even God. But when faith becomes a bank, every debt becomes sacred, and when kings owed too much, reverence turned to resentment. The monarchs of France, England and beyond had borrowed vast sums to fund their crusades, and when the wars ended, they refused to repay. How could a king bow before the knights of God? By the 13th century, the Templars stood at their height. In Paris, their headquarters formed a city within the city, with treasuries, armories, and secret tunnels. At their zenith, their wealth rivaled the royal treasury of France. A religious order had become a power greater than kingdoms themselves, a fact that no pope or monarch could rest easy with. And here, the shadow of tragedy began to take shape. The Templars became victims of their own perfection. Those who live between faith and fortune are destined to be betrayed by both. In their chapels, prayers still rose each dawn, but in the vaults below, coins still clinked each night. Their silence, once a symbol of discipline, now became a veil for secrets. Whispers spread that they worshipped false gods, practiced forbidden rites, and hoarded humanity's lost relics. Perhaps they were lies, but in history, a single rumour is enough to light the fire that ends an age. Looking back, the path of the Templars mirrors that of Europe itself, born in faith, strengthened by war, undone by wealth. They did not merely invent banking, they invented the eternal conflict at the heart of Western civilization, the struggle between the soul and profit. And now, as their vaults deepened and their contracts multiplied, as prayers mingled with the sound of counting coins, faith itself began to change colour. Something inevitable was approaching. The keepers of God's treasure were about to become the condemned. For in the history of the Middle Ages, every power, no matter how holy its robe, must pay its price. And that price would be set on one day, Friday the 13th, when faith would burn in the very fire it had once kindled, as the gold vaults of the Templars sank deeper into the earth, and the crossmark contracts passed from hand to trembling hand across Europe. A shadow watched them with a cold smile. Philip of France, the man history would remember as Philip the Fair. Beneath the silken cloak and the proud eyes of a young monarch, Philip was not merely the ruler of a vast kingdom, he was Europe's greatest debtor. And that debt, born from endless wars with England and Flanders, lay in the hands of men he could not command. The Knights Templar, the soldiers of God, and the bankers of a continent. In the previous chapter, the Templars had risen from poverty to become the treasurers of faith. But to Philip, they were no longer the saintly guardians of holy relics. They were a financial and political threat. In an age when royal power was still checked by the church and the knightly orders, Philip understood that to become an absolute monarch, he would have to do the unthinkable, break the symbols of God. The crisis began when Philip once again needed gold for war. He borrowed from the Templars, from Lombard merchants, and from the Jews. But as battles dragged on and the royal treasury ran dry, he seized Jewish property, expelled their people from France, and then turned toward the Templars, too rich to ignore. Philip did not only wish to erase his debt, he wished to erase his creditors. Thus, in the first years of the 14th century, a conspiracy took root behind the stone walls of the Louvre Palace. Philip crafted a story that the Knights Templar had betrayed God, worshipped demons, desecrated the cross, and committed crimes against the faith. The rumour spread like fire, and Philip found the perfect ally. Pope Clement V, a weak and pliant man placed upon the papal throne through the pressure of the French crown. Beneath the shadow of Paris, even Rome began to tremble. Then came the appointed day, Friday, October 13th, 1307. A sealed order was dispatched across the realm. At the same hour, on the same morning, every Templar preceptory, fortress and chapel was surrounded. Hundreds of knights were arrested at once, their treasures seized, their documents sealed. The citizens of France awoke to see the white-clad warriors, once revered as saints, chained and paraded through the streets like criminals. It was the first coordinated mass arrest in the history of Europe, executed with chilling precision. A web of power that had spanned continents was shattered in a single night. The accusations were ready. The Templars were said to have kissed the image of the devil, denied Christ, and performed heretical rites. But these confessions were born of torture. Prisoners were stretched on racks burned with red-hot irons and drowned in basins of water until their lungs filled. When the sound of breaking bones echoed through the dungeons, Philip declared that truth had been revealed. In the years that followed, the Templars were publicly tried. Their wealth was transferred to the Hospitallers, the Order of St. John, though in truth, much of the treasure quietly flowed into the French royal treasury. The leaders, including Grand Master Jacques de Molay, were imprisoned for 7 years in the dark. Philip believed he had triumphed, but faith is not so easily extinguished. In 1314, when de Molay was led to the stake on the Île de la Cité, the old man stood upright in the flames, gaunt but unbroken, and proclaimed the innocence of his brothers. Before the fire consumed him, he turned toward Notre Dame and called upon the judgment of God, cursing Philip and Clement, declaring they would both stand before the divine tribunal within a year. The curse, though wrapped in legend, became one of Europe's most haunting tales. Within months, Pope Clement died of illness. Philip fell from his horse and perished in agony. The people whispered that God had heard the knight's final prayer, yet what remains most terrifying is not the curse, but Europe's silence afterward. A brotherhood that once managed a third of the continent's wealth was erased by the will of one king, and no one dared speak. The death of the Templars marked a threshold, the end of the medieval age of faith, and the birth of the modern age of power. Philip IV, with his icy cunning, had created a new template for rule, using the accusation of heresy as a weapon and wielding faith as a tool of politics. From that moment on, whenever a ruler sought to sanctify violence, he needed only to declare it the will of God. And so, Friday the 13th, that fateful morning, became the enduring emblem of betrayal wrapped in holiness. If you stand in Paris today, on the spot where Jacques de Molay was burned, no trace of the pyre remains. Only the quiet murmur of the Seine drifts by, and the shadow of Notre Dame falls over the water like a reminder. All power, no matter how divine it claims to be, dissolves with time. Philip IV may have won, but his victory proved a single eternal truth, that when faith is used as a weapon, it will one day turn and burn the hand that wields it. And thus, from that Friday the 13th onward, Europe entered a new age, one where faith no longer guided light, but flickered faintly in the trembling hands of those who had learned to use it to illuminate their own power. As the night of Friday the 13th faded into memory, Europe seemed at peace again. Yet beneath the ash of forced confessions, the fire never truly died. It smouldered quietly, in the chapels, in whispers passed from mouth to mouth, in the wary glances cast toward the throne of France. For there was one truth that could not be imprisoned, tortured, or bought: faith itself, and it would burn again, in the very flames King Philip had lit to destroy it. By the early 14th century, most of the Knights Templar were gone, executed, scattered, or absorbed by other orders, their fortresses confiscated, their names erased from chronicles. But one man remained, Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master, the soul of the order. For 7 years he endured chains and darkness, waiting for judgment from men who spoke in the name of God, yet acted in the service of the devil. On a cold March afternoon, by the still waters of the Seine, they brought him to the stake. Before him stood 3 wooden pyres, beside him 2 knights condemned to burn with him. The people of Paris crowded the riverbanks, not to see a heretic die, but to witness the death of an age. They said that when the fire was lit, de Molay did not scream or beg. He lifted his head toward Notre Dame, his voice calm as stone. How unjust it is that liars condemn the faithful. Before God, I die pure, and I summon King Philip and Pope Clement to meet me before his throne, within 1 year, to answer for the betrayal of faith. Then the flames took him. The wind carried the smell of smoke, charred flesh, and candle wax, the mingled sense of ritual and execution, of religion and sin. The crowd fell silent. No one dared to speak, but all understood. This was not an ending. It was a warning. Months later, Pope Clement V fell ill and died in agony. His body, laid in a chapel coffin, was struck by lightning, and the fire consumed both church and corpse, as if heaven itself was signing the curse of Jacques de Molay. Not long after, Philip the Fair was thrown from his horse and perished in the forest. Historians may call it coincidence. The people of France did not. They whispered that the fire had found its own justice. From that moment, de Molay ceased to be a heretic. He became the martyr of betrayed faith, a man who stood serene amid the flames, a symbol of conscience against the machinery of power. Yet the strangest thing followed. After the Templars' destruction, Europe did not grow safer. It grew emptier. Faith cracked. No knights remained to guard the pilgrims, no orders to hold God's treasure in trust, no single belief strong enough to bind the continent. Monarchs fell into wars, popes into exile. The unity of Christendom, once its bedrock, began to fracture. Seen through modern eyes, the trial of the Templars was not merely a political purge or a religious inquisition. It was the moment when faith was seized by power. From then on, every prayer carried a price. Every sacred symbol bore political meaning. And when men rule in the name of God, they do not merely burn their enemies. They burn the very light that once guided them. Still, in the centuries that followed, the flame of Jacques de Molay endured in imagination. Secret brotherhoods and mystic orders, from the Freemasons to the Rosicrucians, would honour him as the saint of inner freedom. In their candlelit rituals his name was spoken, a reminder that belief can be burned but never erased. De Molay did not die merely for the temple. He died for the idea that faith cannot be controlled. In an age where every creed bowed before politics, his death proved that some souls choose to stay loyal to themselves, even when loyalty cost them their life. And that is the deepest paradox of the Middle Ages. Power rose in the name of God, yet believed only in fear. The fall of the Templars reveals a pattern that haunts all history. Every time power tries to destroy faith, it only forges a new one, stronger and more defiant, glowing like embers beneath the ash. So if you listen closely by the scene, you might still hear the faint crackle of fire, not of vengeance, but of remembrance. The spirit of Jacques de Molay wanders there, whispering, "Be careful when you act in God's name, for God does not stand with the powerful." From the ashes of the temple, Europe would rise into a new age, the age of stone, light and memory, when cathedrals reached for heaven as if rebuilding what the sword had destroyed. But before the light, there would be shadow. The long, cold shadow of the Templars' fire, reminding the world that every throne built on fear will one day burn, for it forgets that it was meant to guard faith, not possess it. The ashes of Jacques de Molay scattered into the wind, drifting down into the Seine, and perhaps, in some quiet way, came to rest beneath the shadow of Notre-Dame de Paris. It is no coincidence that people believe this, for if the Templars were faith berfeithre, where hands that once trembled in prayer turned into architecture, and prayers themselves took Notre-Dame de Paris was begun in the 12th century, a time when France was recovering from the chaos of the early Crusades. In that age, people did not simply wish to raise a place of worship. They longed to prove that faith was still alive, still capable of lifting humankind from the ashes of its own guilt. Thus, Gothic architecture was born, not as a style, but as a prayer made. When you stand before the facade of Notre Dame, whether by day or night, you feel something beyond words, as if this place were not built by human hands, but condensed from faith itself. The pillars rise like supplications, the vaults interlace like the threads of souls ascending toward heaven. This is no longer a dwelling for men, but a dwelling for light. The three breaths of Gothic architecture, the flying buttress, the rose window and the gargoyle, give the cathedral its rhythm. The flying buttress is not merely a feat of engineering. It is a metaphor for faith that can bear the weight of the world. Massive stones held aloft by arcs light as angels' hands. The rose window, those stained circles of crimson, blue and gold, is the church's soul. When sunlight passes through, it falls upon the floor like the gaze of God, gentle yet severe, and the gargoyles crouching along the roofline are the shadow of that same faith. Reminders that to rise toward heaven, one must first face the demons within. There is something beautiful in knowing that Notre Dame was not built by architects or priests alone, but by thousands of nameless craftsmen. They could not read, they did not know Latin, yet in each strike of the chisel they carved what their hands understood and their hearts believed. For them, every brick was a prayer, every hammer blow a step toward light. In an age when souls were thought to be weighed after death, to labour for God was the surest path to eternity. Notre Dame was more than a church. It was the heart of Paris, the measure of time and spirit. When its bells rang, the city breathed as one. When pilgrims knelt, they believed themselves a little nearer to heaven. The 12th and 13th centuries, the era that raised Notre Dame, were the pinnacle of faith in stone. From Chartres to Amiens, from Reims to Cologne, Europe's spires reached for the clouds. Each cathedral was not merely a building, but a declaration that in a world of war, God still dwelled here, in light filtered through coloured glass. How ironic that only centuries before men like Jacques de Molay had been burned alive for heresy, and now, upon the same soil, humanity poured its sweat and treasure into building the house of God. Perhaps that is the essence of the Middle Ages, brutality and sanctity forever intertwined. Humanity could burn one another in the morning, and by evening build altars to pray for the souls they had destroyed. Look closer, and you will see the shadows of that same age inside Notre Dame. On its carvings, demons and saints share the same stone. In its niches, the faces of pilgrims kneel beside twisted, suffering forms. The builders understood. Faith is not pure light. It is light passing through darkness. When the last sun of the day strikes the rose window, the glass flares like embers in a forge. It is the same light that has travelled through centuries, through dust and war, through revolution and forgetting, carrying with it both human devotion and human sin. Somehow Notre Dame remembers both. Historians call this the Age of Cathedrals, the time when Europe poured all its fear, hope and guilt into stone. They knew that man was fragile, but stone endures. When kings succumbed to ambition, when popes lost their souls, it was the cathedrals that held the last remnants of faith. And in every peal of its bells, there still echoes the name of Jacques de Molay, and of all those who burned for belief. The sound, deep and slow, seems to say, faith does not die. It only changes form from fire to stone, from sorrow to light. From the previous chapter, where faith was consumed by flame, to this one, faith has transformed. No longer carried by swords or guarded by knights, it exists now only in light passing through stained glass, touching the hearts of those who still look upward. Notre Dame, more than 8 centuries later, still stands as a prayer without end, and if you stand beneath its vaults, watching sunlight spill through the rose windows, you will understand why those who built it called it the Cathedral of the Century. Not because it was the largest or the most beautiful, but because it preserved what even empires could not: the capacity to believe in the sacred. As Notre Dame's stones endured the centuries and its bells kept tolling, people began to think that faith had at last become eternal, that what was built of light could never again be touched by shadow. But time, like every dynasty, has its own way of shaking what seems immortal. The darkness of the 18th century came not from superstition or war, but from something brighter, reason. By the century's end, Europe no longer knelt as it once had. Light no longer entered through glass, but through books, through the words of Voltaire, Rousseau, Diderot, those who believed that knowledge alone could free mankind. They said, if man wished to be free, he must destroy divine authority. If he sought progress, he must kill the symbols that bound him for centuries. And so, in the fervour of the Age of Enlightenment, the French Revolution erupted, part awakening, part apocalypse. In 1789, the crowds flooded Paris. They did not merely storm the Bastille, they toppled the pillars of an entire world. The saints and churches built with sweat and faith were now seen as monuments of oppression. Notre Dame, the cathedral of centuries, suddenly became the enemy of the people. The Virgin statue was pulled down, her head severed, the cross removed, the altar replaced by the altar of reason, a new, colder, and far more abstract deity. Within the nave, a festival was held in honour of the goddess of reason, a living woman draped in the colours of the Revolution, seated upon the throne where once stood the Virgin. The crowd cheered, the music thundered, but no one knelt. They stood upright, believing mankind no longer needed God. Yet when the noise faded, what remained was silence, a silence so deep it revealed a truth. Reason can destroy idols, but it cannot replace belief. Outside, Paris changed by the hour. Liberté, égalité, fraternité was carved into the walls, yet blood still darkened the cobblestones. The guillotine became the new instrument of justice, a justice that required no God, no confession, only verdicts. In the square, not far from Notre Dame, heads fell to the cheers of the crowd. They called it the light of a new age, yet that light was cold as steel. In those years, Notre Dame became a warehouse, then a wine cellar, then an armory. The rose windows shattered, the saints buried beneath rubble. Europe looked toward Paris, once the heart of faith, and saw only a silent church. From a historical view, it was humanity's greatest paradox. Man overthrew religion in the name of reason, yet reason itself became a new religion, strict, absolute, and willing to kill to preserve its purity. Robespierre, the fiery revolutionary, declared, "The old faith is dead, but the new faith is love of the nation." Thus, from crucifix to flag, only the symbol changed. The worship remained. In that smoke and ruin, Notre Dame was not merely a damaged building. It was the image of Europe decapitating its own faith. The severed head of the Virgin was a prophecy. When man grants himself the right to decide all things, he also loses the power to believe in anything beyond himself. Yet even in that darkness, a faint flame endured. Among the rubble, some quietly gathered broken statues, hid crosses in their homes and continued to pray, not from fear but from refusal to believe that mankind could live entirely without a soul. When the terror finally ended, when the last guillotine blade fell silent, Paris felt empty. People discovered they had gained freedom but lost meaning. They had claimed reason but forfeited reverence, the humility, the fear, the forgiveness that make life bearable. It was then that history turned bitter. Humanity cannot live on bread and the light of reason alone. Notre Dame in ruins still stood, its walls scorched, its roof bare, but its stone skeleton steadfast, a witness that refused to die. Perhaps that is why the church was never destroyed completely, as though Paris, however drunk on revolution, could not fully kill its past. If you had stood before it in the early 19th century, you would have seen a melancholy sight. Birds nesting in its towers, moss covering its windows, beggars sleeping at its gates. No bells, no prayers, only wind moaning through hollow pillars, like the breath of a dying soul. From those ashes, a question began to echo across Europe. Can reason replace faith, or is it merely another kind of faith, colder, lonelier? And as that question spread, it would find its answer, not in politics or philosophy, but in literature, when a single writer would arrive to rewrite the fate of Notre Dame and remind the world that even if the Virgin's head had been severed, the cathedral's soul still slept beneath the dust, waiting for someone to wake it. That is where we shall go next, to Victor Hugo and Notre Dame de Paris, the moment when literature redeemed faith and light returned, not through stained glass but through words. For decades after the Revolution, Notre Dame still stood, silent, tattered, and almost forgotten amid a Paris reborn in the name of modernity. People passed it as they would a ghost. The stones that once were prayers now served as backdrop for street vendors, for the clatter of carriages and the smoke of coal. Sometimes children hurled stones at the headless saints, not out of hatred for God, but because they no longer knew who he was. The age when faith could make an entire city kneel had long passed, and in that silence, Notre Dame became the symbol of a forgotten memory, the memory of a Europe that once believed the human soul could be saved by light, not merely by reason. Then, in the early 19th century, when the dust of revolution had begun to settle, France turned to look at itself again. Paris now had wide boulevards, government buildings, academies and theatres. Yet the more modern it became, the emptier it felt. The Romantics, those restless thinkers of the New Age, looked around and saw a nation that had lost its memory. Not its political memory, but its spiritual one. The memory of fear, of prayer, of the fragile belief that once made humankind feel part of something greater. In 1831, Victor Hugo published Notre Dame de Paris, a novel that, upon appearing, changed not only literature but the way people looked at history itself. Under his pen, the cathedral ceased to be a mere building of stone. It became a living being. It could love, it could suffer, it could witness and remain silent. Quasimodo, the outcast hunchback, was not merely a tragic figure but the embodiment of Notre Dame itself, ugly on the outside yet carrying within it an entire world of humanity. And Esmeralda, condemned, hanged, trampled by the crowd, was the reflection of faith betrayed by mankind, much as Paris had betrayed its own church. Every page of Hugo's book read like a collective confession. He did not ask people to return to God. He asked them not to forget that religious memory had once formed the soul of France. Notre Dame de Paris was not a love story. It was a bell of awakening. It made the French realize that those walls of stone were not relics, but witnesses. They had stood when faith was born, when it was betrayed, when it was burned, and still they stood, waiting for someone to listen. The tremor caused by the novel spread further than anyone expected. Crowds began to gather again to look upon the cathedral. Newspapers wrote of its decay. The government, indifferent for so many years, now feared that France was letting its soul crumble stone by stone. And in that wave of renewed awe, a young architect named Eugène Viollet-le-Duc was given the task of restoring Notre Dame. The work began in the mid-19th century, not a repair, but a resurrection. Viollet-le-Duc did not simply rebuild what was lost, he reinterpreted the church's soul. Under his hands the spires rose again, higher and more delicate, as if to reach upward on behalf of all the forgotten prayers. He restored the rose windows, recreated the Virgin statue, and even added new details, such as the distant-eyed gargoyles, to remind mankind that true faith must always contain its shadows. The project lasted decades. When it was done, Notre Dame once again became the heart of Paris, not merely a monument, but a living proof that the human spirit can be saved through memory. People came to admire it, but in truth, they were searching for something they had lost, the quiet peace of belief, even if they no longer defined it through religion. For Hugo and Viollet-le-Duc, faith was no longer something to be prayed to, but something to be understood and cherished. The cathedral no longer belonged to the church, it belonged to humanity. Each restored detail was not decoration, but a story retold, that once men knew how to bow before beauty and the sacred. When you stand before Notre Dame after its restoration, you do not merely see a 12th century structure reborn, you see all of Europe trying to heal its own soul. Centuries of wars, revolutions, and the collapse of belief all found shelter within its walls. It no longer belonged to France alone, but to the collective memory of humankind. Through the reconstructed stained glass, the light again carried the same ancient hues. Red for blood, blue for hope, gold for the divine. Each morning the bells rang, no longer as the commands of God, but as the heartbeat of a resurrected spirit. From the last chapter, where faith was beheaded in the name of reason, we arrive at a beautiful paradox. It was literature, the child of reason, that redeemed faith. Hugo rebuilt the cathedral not with stone, but with words. Viollet-le-Duc merely gave those words form. A writer wrote, an architect built, and together they restored what an entire age had tried to destroy, the belief that there are sacred things which cannot be forgotten. As night falls over Paris, the lights strike the spires of Notre Dame and shimmer upon the Seine, a gentle light, not the blinding glare of reason, but the warm glow of remembrance. And if you stand there long enough, you may hear something faint. The echo of Quasimodo, of Esmeralda, of all the souls that once slept in stone, whispering together that light has returned out of the ashes. When Notre Dame rose again through the hands of Hugo and Viollet-le-Duc, it seemed as though the cathedral's soul had been entrusted to a new age, one that could honour the past without being bound by it. For nearly 2 centuries thereafter, the great church stood at the heart of Paris as a silent witness to time. It saw the fall of Napoleon's empire, the outbreak of 2 world wars, the German occupation and withdrawal, and heard the peal of freedom when Paris was liberated. At every turning point of history, Notre Dame remained, voiceless, steadfast, the heartbeat of a nation. And yet on an April evening of the 21st century, in the age of smartphones and mass tourism, fire once again came for the place that had long symbolized light. The flames began in the roof, the ancient wooden framework called the forest, built from thousands of oaks that had sprouted when night still rode through medieval Paris. As the fire spread, the central spire, Viollet-le-Duc's creation, bowed and fell, like a man lowering his head in one last prayer. The people of Paris stood on the far bank of the Seine silent. Some wept, others lifted their phones to record, but most simply stood still, hands clasped before their chests. As the flames climbed toward the vaults, someone began to sing Ave Maria, and the melody passed softly through the crowd. A familiar hymn sung through smoke and tears, blending with the sirens and the crackle of burning wood. In that moment, the world fell silent, not because a building was burning, but because memory was burning. When the roof collapsed, thousands of ashes scattered like small souls, each carrying a fragment of the past. The labour of craftsmen 8 centuries gone, the prayers once uttered in the vaulted air, the coronations of kings beneath those arches. The fire raged for hours, and when at last it was subdued, only the stone skeleton remained, bare but unbroken. Those images reminded the world of a truth long forgotten, that what we lost was not merely a structure, but a fragment of our collective soul. Notre Dame did not belong solely to Paris, nor only to Christendom. It was a vessel for humanity's capacity to feel the sacred. In an age of skepticism, where everything is analysed, explained and dissected, that cathedral still had the power to make people fall silent. And in that silence, they found what knowledge could never replace: faith. Before the smoke had cleared, millions across the world sent donations, not out of religion, but out of fear of losing memory itself. Someone said, "I've never been inside the cathedral, but when it burned, it felt as if part of my childhood burned with it." Another wrote, "I've never believed in God, but that night as I heard Ave Maria through my screen, I realized I was praying." Those words revealed the truth. Faith does not dwell in stone. It lives in the human capacity to feel, to grieve, to revere, to sense loss before beauty. When the roof fell, another roof rose, the roof of remembrance. And perhaps that is the deepest form of faith, to believe that something deserves to be preserved, even knowing it may vanish. In the previous chapter, we saw how Hugo and Viollet-le-Duc resurrected Notre Dame through literature and architecture. But on the night of the 2019 fire, it was the people of Paris who brought it back to life through emotion. No kings, no popes, only thousands standing in silence, and millions more watching from afar, all united by the same stillness. A world that seemed fractured, for one moment, shared a single silence. When dawn came after the fire, the sun struck the charred tower, and smoke still drifted above the vaults. Amid the ashes, the golden cross on the altar remained untouched. That image spread across the world, not merely as a religious sign, but as a metaphor for the endurance of faith. Everything can collapse: wood, glass, spire, roof. Yet light, even a faint reflection, can still pierce the smoke and survive. In the months that followed, restoration began. Hundreds of artisans, architects and historians joined to heal the wound with their hands, just as their ancestors had 8 centuries before. And once again the world watched, not to see Notre Dame as it was, but to witness humanity believing once more that the lost can be rebuilt. History seemed to close a circle, from fire to stone, from ruin to rebirth, and back to fire. But this time, we knew how to keep our soul intact. No nights, no mass, only the silence before wounded beauty and the will to raise it again. On the night of the fire, no one spoke of God. No one asked why. They simply watched, and in the red light of the flames we saw ourselves, small, fragile, grateful. For in the end, as one Parisian said the next morning, faith does not live in stone, but in human memory. And as long as we can mourn, as long as we can weep for a burning roof, that faith, nameless yet alive, endures. Notre Dame has survived 8 centuries of war, revolution, rebirth and fire. Yet the miracle is not that it still stands, but that we still need it. In an age of endless noise, it reminds us of a rare kind of silence, the silence where even those who no longer believe still bow before what is sacred, though they can no longer name it. And perhaps that is the true legacy of Notre Dame, not a temple only for God but for memory, the meeting place of light and ash, where humanity learns, if only for a moment, how to believe again. When we look back upon all that has passed, the mad kings, the fallen priests, the flames that consumed faith, the domes rebuilt, it is easy to forget that it all revolves around a single thing: humanity and its limits. Power, faith, reason, they are but different garments worn to hide our deepest fear, the fear of losing control, of being forgotten, of facing ourselves. Medieval history is not a record of darkness, but of endless trial and rebirth. When a king descends into madness, his kingdom may fall, yet society learns the limits of power. When religion becomes tyranny, people are forced to ask what freedom and morality mean. And when a cathedral burns, the world discovers that the sacred is not in stone, but in the collective ability to grieve and rebuild. These stories are not distant. Even now, we walk the same path in new disguises. There are still those who believe they are the centre of the world, and still the small and the faithful who keep believing while everything crumbles around them. But in those moments, history whispers the same old truth. Human strength lies not in triumph, but in the ability to rise again after loss. If there is one lesson the Middle Ages left us, it is this: all orders will falter, all powers will fade, but human patience and the will to believe will not. For as long as someone remembers, someone rebuilds, someone tells the story, nothing is ever truly lost. And so, in our restless modern world, we need not seek eternal symbols. We only need to keep one simple thing, the will to endure.